Death Stranding on Steam Deck. So there's two versions of Death Stranding on PC, the Director's Cut and the original. Unfortunately, the original is not being sold anymore. You can only buy the Director's Cut. And if you own the original already, you can pay a small price for an upgrade. Personally, I think the original is just fine, but both of them are verified. So what changes between those two versions? Well, let's take a quick look. I did a side-by-side with the exact same settings. The Director's Cut has upscaling options, but when it comes to performance, apart from the Director's Cut having lower brightness because I effed up something, it seems to be running almost the same, more spiky frame times sometimes in the Director's Cut. And when there is heavy post-processing, the Director's Cut takes like a 5 FPS hit. Then when it comes to raining or walking around, again, some spikes in the frame times, a few frames behind the Director's Cut, which is interesting. But at the same time, I was expecting a bigger difference, all things considered. Unfortunately, the Director's Cut, when you buy it, it doesn't include the original. So if you have the original, I highly recommend that one. But if you got the Director's Cut, it's not a deal breaker in my opinion. I mean, sometimes there's a 4 or 5 FPS difference, but again, when there is very heavy post-processing, they seem to have tweaked that a little bit. And it's a little bit buggy in the options menu sometimes. I'm going to dig into the Director's Cut a little bit more in a moment, but if you have the original and the Director's Cut, on the Steam Deck, I highly recommend you just play the original. On the options menu, we got, unfortunately, only 21:9, which looks horrible in the smaller screen, and 16:9. There's no 16:10. You should be able to mod it in, but I tried and it was kind of a pain in the ass. Most people are not going to do it, in my opinion, so stick to 720p. If you have the OLED Steam Deck, the black bars won't be noticeable, but on the LCD, you'll see those black bars at the top and bottom of the screen. Maximum frame rate, you might see that this is locked to 60 or sometimes below. I don't know why this is kind of buggy in this menu. I just keep it unlocked to show you guys I unlocked the frame rate. When it comes to graphics quality, it's basically medium settings, medium models, default memory streaming, shadow resolution on medium as well. You can also put it on low, but it's not a huge difference when it comes to performance. Ambient occlusion and screen space reflections, I would say, is the biggest performance difference. But with this disabled, the game looks super flat, and without screen space reflections, the parts with water looked super flat. So in my opinion, these two should stay there. It's a balance of visuals and performance over here that we're trying to do. Then you have multiple upscaling options. These are missing from the normal Death Stranding. If you have the original, these options won't be here. You can also disable anti-aliasing, which is good. And NIS and FSR 1.0 I think are the worst looking. These are more like linear upscalers with sharpening. And in my opinion, in this case, the best performing one is FSR 2, and it looks okay. You can go up to quality. I'll keep it on balance with sharpness at 60%. Which is nice to see that sharpness is also available. Then when it comes to depth of field and motion blur, that's personal preference. I don't personally like motion blur, and depth of field, in this case I enabled it because in cutscenes it makes a huge difference. Alright, so welcome to Death Stranding. This is the first part of the game. I'm going to show you more, of course. And first impressions on performance are above 50, but there are drops here and there, especially when scanning the terrain. You can drop into the mid-40s. But again, here I didn't disable ambient occlusion or reflections because it's a very noticeable drop in performance and you're not going to get that much closer to 60. And in a game like this that you're mostly walking around, I don't think it's a big deal to have performance like this when looking into a distance. I'll even lock it to 45. I'll show you that once we're in handheld mode with a 45 FPS cap, so you can also see how much battery life it requires. But as you can see, there are stutters here and there are drops below 60. Visually, I think it's okay with the sharpness at 60 and balanced FSR2. But this is not the only moment in the game where you're going to be playing. There is a way more demanding section when you're fighting, which is pretty rare, but it's there. And you'll see why I'll lock it to 45. We seem to be mostly CPU limited actually. The GPU usage doesn't get maxed out. And there are spikes in the CPU usage that lead to stutters. Hopefully that can be resolved by just locking the frame rate to 45. So I think it's time to jump into handheld mode and let's see what happens. Again, it's mostly cutscenes and walking around. Fighting is more of a rare occurrence. And also, since at the beginning it was raining, that's why it was also dropping below 60. So by looking at this you might say, oh man, it's 60 across the board, awesome. Well, not quite, not 100% there, unfortunately. It's a Decima engine game, same engine as Horizon Zero Dawn, which is pretty impressive considering the performance, at least in my opinion. So let me show you something more demanding. So this is another part of the city that you unlock way later on. That, at least for me, it was way more CPU demanding. As you can see, the GPU usage is below 90%. The clock speed of the GPU is also dropping below 1000 MHz. Again, remember that the GPU could go up to 1600 if it had enough power to share with the CPU to do so. So as you can see, it can stutter and drop into the upper 40s. So yeah, more demanding. In my opinion, what you should do here, if you have the LCD Steam Deck, lock it to 40 FPS, and if you have this one, the OLED, you can put it at 45. But again, if you're on the LCD, 40s should be good enough just to maintain that frame rate across the board, because you'll be running around this part, but then you're going to have some combat, which is pretty rare, let's be honest here. When it comes to traversal, I think we're heavily CPU limited. When we try to get 60s consistently. Even at the lowest settings I had those drops and stutters. Before I forget to mention, if you go to the options menu there is HDR settings, so if you enable it, in my opinion the game does look a lot better on the OLED screen. You can tweak the brightness way more now in the HDR option. You will notice this on the camera because, well, my camera is nothing special. But my recommendation is that you use HDR. It actually looks pretty good, at least in my experience. It's hard to go back after that, but you can tweak it to your heart's content or just play in SDR. But as you can see, with a 45 FPS cap, again, 2.5 to 3 hours of battery on the OLED. So let's jump into a boss fight. Now in a boss fight, which again, it's a very rare occurrence in this game. I think there is 8 boss fights or something like that. So you actually have a gun over here. But again, as I was saying, this is pretty rare. I think I'm 30 hours in this part. But as you can see, the stuttering gets worse. I'm also fighting in the section that I just showed you. But now with more effects on screen, a giant character in front of me, water that produces reflections. So again, this would be like a worse case scenario than before. As you can see, it suffers way more. Instead of 2.5 hours, we get 2 hours. And it drops below 45 pretty often, but again, I'm ignoring this a bit more selectively because of its rare occurrence. I mean, just shooting a gun in a game like this feels weird. It's not the main point. But I wanted to show you that because it's part of the game, whether we like it or not. And this is another boss fight that I got to that has less geometry, to say it in some way. Instead of the city is in a more open environment. So let's aim and shoot. But this one I think is a little bit more water on screen and more effects, which looks pretty cool, don't get me wrong, but not even disabling the reflections help in this case, which is unfortunate. These parts are just super taxing. Kind of reminds me of Horizon Zero Dawn when it comes to that. When there is something more complex like this, it can plummet pretty hard, as you can see right now. Look at the CPU and the GPU. They're fighting for those 15 watts that they have available. But alas, something like this happens. That's why I'm using balanced FSR2. So yeah, these are, to say it in some way, the heavy parts. Anyway, since this game is mostly walking and traversing, I'm also going to show you some of that. So with the worst case scenarios out of the way, let's get into the meat of the game.
And the like are stocked with materials you can use to fabricate.
So again, would I recommend that Stranding on Steam Deck? I mean, personally, I'm not a fan of Strand type games. I'm more of an action game enthusiast, more of a Metal Gear guy when it comes to Kojima games. So when it comes to performance, I think it's fine. The thing is, when you get those stutters like you see right now, or the boss fights are especially painful when it comes to the Steam Deck's CPU and GPU. Then when it comes to delivering packages, it's okay. Personally, I'll lock it to 45 on the OLED and to 40 on the LCD, so it's more consistent across the board. But overall, it's completely fine. Hideo Kojima has a talent for releasing optimized games. Just think about Metal Gear Solid 5, it runs like a dream on Steam Deck. And this is on the Decima engine, same engine as Horizon Zero Dawn, but probably has some customizations that, well, the engine didn't originally have, that's my guess. But yeah, you have 2.5 hours of battery on the OLED with a 45 FPS cap, probably 90 to 100 minutes on the LCD. And as long as you are delivering packages, you should be good. Just some CPU usage spikes when you're traversing after quite a few meters. If you're driving around, it will be more noticeable. And in boss fights, which are pretty rare in this game, you get those drops in performance that you cannot fix, unfortunately, even by lowering the settings to the absolute lowest. Okay, so now we kick him. Or we punch him while crouching. There we go. He's knocked out. And let's drive around a little. Very, very little to see the stability. Oh, okay, there's more of them. Yeah, when driving around, it also hits the CPU very, very hard. Just look at that frame time. So yeah. I would say, yeah, maybe a 40 FPS cap makes more sense. Unless you don't mind those drops when driving and in boss fights. Otherwise, you should be good to go. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I wanted to show you multiple places for testing, just because sometimes I just see people walking around when showing this game, and I think that's not 100% realistic, because, well, as you can see, the performance difference is quite large when there is something going on, such as enemies chasing you while you drive, or just boss fights in general, which is a shame. I also saw a couple issues when I was watching cutscenes. The cutscenes were stuttery. Some people said disable vibration. That actually worked for me. So if you are having stuttery cutscenes, disable controller vibration. For some reason that worked for me. And then when it comes to the director's cut, some people said that importing your save file from the previous game, from the original, caused them to have more stutter. That seems to be a common issue, so if you don't mind starting from scratch on the director's cut, I recommend you do so. You play the original or just a new game in the director's cut. But that's basically it. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have the original, play that one. If you only have the director's cut, play that one. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye guys.